I wanted to, I mean, there's so many things to talk about, and I could certainly ask all of the questions. And maybe we should define this a little bit as to what we call this work that we're engaged in. And there's a little bit of sort of back and forth on various conversations, blogs about, you know, how you assess the artfulness and success of something and the authorship. You know, is it community authored? Is it Rick Lowe authorship or Janeil's authorship? You know, and propriety in that way, as well as just whether it's more civic or whether it's more activism oriented or whether it's more art world oriented, or how does it. So maybe just defining, you know, like some of the terms. I know years ago we came up with, if you didn't fall into the traditional sort of scope of, you know, the studio arts and performance, you were called alternative. And since then we've had expanded fields that has opened up as, you know, a lot of new genres, and everything from constructed photography on to whatever. And so there are lots of names and titles given to what we're now sort of calling socially engaged art, or social practice, or dialogistics, or, you know, interventionist art works. And so,
what? I'm the interventionist. And
all kinds of things happen under these auspices of whatever. But I'm curious, because this is what came up in this Ben Davis article that's been kind of floating around, is that, you know, the vocabulary has not really been defined completely as to, you know, how this is being recognized, and on what various, like when you get into an argument about, you know, whether it's this or that, it's like define your terms, and those are happening, there are people working on that. But I'm just curious.
Well, you know, Rick and I have talked about this quite a bit, and, you know, Janeil and I have had discussions about, you know, what we're doing, et cetera. It's just interesting to me. I didn't have any term for what I do. I noticed, however, that fairly recently, I mean, because this has all become a conversation on a national level fairly recently in terms of giving some title to, you know, this work. It struck me that back in the mid-'70s, late '70s, when I got into arts administration, there was no arts administration. I mean, it was like we artists who wanted to continue to wear designer shoes, because I'm one of them, we had to get real jobs. And at that time, there was an opportunity, you know, to go into the world that is now defined as arts administration. And once that got labeled and termed, and then you started having these schools that wanted to teach it, you know, I can tell you that none of the people I worked with at the Connecticut Commission on the Arts had any idea of how to administer anything. But we were all artists. We were all very creative about the way in which we did things, and a lot of very innovative programs came out of that. You know, now, of course, you go get your Masters of Arts Administration, which usually has nothing to do with practice. And the same thing has kind of happened to those of us who are working in community as artists, using art as a tool for, you know, doing social justice work. You know, we didn't call it anything. It's called you used the creative abilities that you had to help people that you were responding to with some urgency. When I was in West Dallas, you know, that's exactly what I was doing. You know, politicizing those little kids so that they would begin to understand they could cross that river and it wouldn't kill them. You know, so, you know, that's what we did. And it seems like we're at that point now where this work needs a term so they can go teach it. Which, I don't know how to teach that.
It's not only the teaching part. I think the teaching part is, that's one part, but I think that there's another part that I'm most aware of, and I think that the ones who are aware of it and good at it gets the better end of it, and it's to money. Mm-hmm. You title something. Titles have a lot of power, right? Mm-hmm. This is a bottle of water, in general. But you let Michael Heiser come through here and say, "Oh, this is a sculpture of a representation of a bottle of water," and he'll put a $500,000 price tag on it, right? It hadn't changed. It's just the title has. And so, the complications I think with titling is that one, on the one hand, it's meaningless. It doesn't have any value whatsoever in terms of the work that you're doing, except for the fact that it does, it can limit or restrict access to resources. Mm-hmm. And so you see that a lot with artists who still kind of use the term community artists. Mm-hmm. Community artists has, for a brief moment in the early 90s, community artist was someone that had some level of respectability because the art world was trying to figure out how to get out of the white walls of the museums and galleries. And so when someone was working in a community as a community artist, they could get resources. But now...
They were fundable.
Yeah, they were fundable. But now it's hard for community artists to really get the attention of funding. And so, being able to navigate those kind of different places. One of the places that's I think is under discussed in this in the idea of, there's a new term now called placemaking. Artists who actually work in communities that develop communities. There's a place in LA called St. Elmo's Village that's been around since the 1960s. Yeah. And it's very interesting. I've been in touch with them and talked to. It's actually been passed on generationally now. The nephew now runs it, Roderick Sykes, and I talked to him about where they are and what they're doing. I mean, they have it's a whole block of apartments and houses and so on and so forth. Not too much unlike Project Row Houses, but they've never really tried to frame themselves in a more contemporary language. And so they've been basically kind of pushed out of the conversation about their work as really contributing to the overall work of artists engaging with communities, in which I think they should be at the forefront because they've been there so long, and to sustain that effort is pretty amazing. And somebody should be interested in knowing, how do you do that?
Mm-hmm. So Janeil, you deal with a lot of different artists who are doing various programs and engaging in really diverse ways. What is there a generalized term? You sort of suggest social practice, but is there any other? How do you identify with? Does it matter?
To me personally, no.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter because I think it's another box, and I find it limiting. But it does matter in certain places. You have to wear different hats. And I like to say artists who are engaging social or environmental issues through their work. But the terms are, it is definitely something that has become a marketplace. Mm-hmm. And it's driven, I actually was talking with someone the other day, a supporter, who said that they're no longer, excuse me, they're no longer collecting physical objects, but they're collecting projects. And so they're approaching it as a collector, but they don't really get a physical object as a result. Instead, they get the joy or whatever it is that they're getting for supporting somebody's work in the world. And they're looking internationally at how artists are working and engaging their non-object-based practice, and deciding aesthetically, because this work does have aesthetics, and aesthetics are important, how do they relate and connect to these aesthetics? And
But when you say it has an aesthetic, I'm really interested in that, because there is, you know, I agree with you that there is an aesthetic component, but is there an identifiable aesthetic? And I say that because it's really interesting how, I was just reading on the panel for one of the shows out there, the one in the hallway, Meek and
Kristen Cochran.
Yeah,
and
Lucia, yeah.
Semmett.
Yeah, and that on the little wall panel there, it said something about, you know, their work reflecting upon the conceptual aesthetic. Conceptualist aesthetic. You know, I mean, you know, I always thought of conceptualism as more of a conceptual thing that was devoid of a particular kind of aesthetic, right? But historically, you know, people, or not even historically, but even in the process of practicing it, you know, when you start to label it and people start trying to find an aesthetic to copy it, you know, to become kind of a copier of an aesthetic, of a certain kind of aesthetic. And so, you know, that was one of the things that was interesting for me about working on this project in Vickery Meadow, because, you know, generally a lot of my projects have to do with physical places, you know, I mean, houses and that kind of stuff. And this one does in a way, but it's not the identifiable aesthetic of the project, you know? And so I'm always kind
suspicious?
Well, not suspicious, but just the term of how we kind of plug or try to identify the aesthetics of something in a way. The naming of something is less concerning to me than the kind of projected aesthetic nature of something. Because a name is just a name. But if you project an aesthetic, then people start to try to
Make it be.
yeah, make it that. And then that's when the real boundaries come up, to me.
I've got lots of things that I want to talk about, but I also want you to, I invite you to ask some questions, because there's never enough time for questions.
Or pose some statements.
Or
Can I ask some
sure.
questions then?
Sure.
How many people in the audience actually think they know what social practice is or social engaged work? Raise your hand.
Raise it high, don't be ashamed.
Yeah, come on, raise it. How many people actually participate in socially engaged work?
If we have to name
Or
it.
have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have to label it. Yeah.
If you have to label it, then.
That's a map artist. Yes, I'm going to shout out my people later too, and they can stay. Because they're here from LA and here and everywhere, okay.
Well, good.
No,
I mean, it is like, I mean, it's a very fluid term, because, I mean, the more you know about it, the more you find out that even the people who are the, you know, participants and the experts in it don't really agree on where they fit in the, you know, in the chain of command, and how they're identified and what those aesthetics are. And I bring that up only because when you act socially, or when you're involved socially with whatever, it has certain political constituents, you know, involved in that interaction. And whether or not, and on one side you have the art world aesthetics. On the other side, you have the activist aesthetics. And it seems like you know, each one is demanding certain claims on what their, you know, what their identity and practice is. And the social artist is sort of in between there and being pulled by these two polar elements. And I guess it's a question of now whether or not blurring the line, as Rauschenberg talked about, blurring the line between art and life, that we're now like, you know, this social practice is blurring the line between activism and art. And
Can I speak to that?
Sure.
And to kind of pick up on Vicki's comment about in Connecticut how no one was, you know, trained as administrators. I started because my response, I'm going to call it a response, and came from, not because I went to school to be a social practice artist, which you can do now. You can go get your MFA in social practice, or because I decided, oh, I'm going to go be a community artist. It's because I was walking down the streets of New York and people were dying of AIDS and people were homeless, and these were my neighbors. They weren't my neighbors like they lived next door, but they were my neighbors because they lived on my corner. I passed the same guy every single day who had his hand out and was asking for money. And the next day, and the next day, and the next person, and the next person. And I was creating work, I was doing photography, and I was getting my MFA, and I was being a photo editor. And I started to volunteer in a homeless shelter, spending the night at St. Joseph's in the Village on Sunday nights, cooking dinner. 20 men would come in, get up in the morning, serve them breakfast, and they would go out. And many of them had jobs, but that's another story. And then I started to volunteer for an organization teaching photography to homeless youth in shelters. And all of a sudden I found a way to respond creatively that made sense to me, much more sense. At the same time, I was very lucky. I was being curated into an exhibition by John Sarkowski, who is an esteemed curator at MoMA, one of the great photography curators. And this other way of being in the world made much more sense to me than this other thing that didn't fulfill me in the same way. And so it was a response that I never decided to be this thing that had language or had this training. I didn't go to school to be this thing. It just was an organic response to life and to my community, and that's continued to be how my practice, if you will call it practice, has evolved. You know, in the 90s I did something on gun violence because I was pissed off that I was picking up the newspaper or I was turning on the television and nobody was reporting. Everyone was reporting upon the issue, but no one was going up to kids and say, so why do you think this is happening in your schools? So I created a national media platform for youth to talk about it. And so that's the kind of, it's more responding.
Well, let me ask you, is it important that you call those activities that you just described art, or that you were an artist doing that, or you know, a
social worker.
A concerned person who's interested in, you know, in improving conditions around?
Well, it's not now, but it was at one time. Mm-hmm. The one time I thought, damn, I paid money for all this degree. I'm going to call myself an artist.
Somebody's going to acknowledge
When
this.
I was at NYU in the 80s, it was the most expensive MFA program in the country. At that time, it was $50,000 a year. And in the 80s, that was a lot of money. You know, and it was like, damn, I'm going to be an artist. But not anymore. You know, and I don't even, and so it's out of my bio. And there's some old ones, but I just say, collaboratively, I've done this. That's how my bio, I don't even say curator, artist, and I'm a producer, really, I guess. I mean, I don't know, but no, that's not important to me anymore.
But
I'm older now. I don't have to have that ego thing as much either, you know. There was a whole thing I mean,
That's the whole thing, is that as you talk to people who are doing the work, for every person that you talk to, you're going to get a whole different conversation about what they're doing and why they're doing it and how they got to that point. I mean, for someone like me who, grew up in an activist family, it actually was a struggle to go into art, because my whole thing was, how am I going to be as impactful as my parents and my, grandmother and all that as an artist. But I found a way, so that's the whole thing, is that I think for every artist that's doing the work, you're going to have a whole different way in which they entered that world and a whole different way of how they navigate that world. Because, Janeil works one way, I work another totally different way. I mean, Rick, I can remember when Ricky started row houses, and we had these conversations about what he wanted from it. And he had one dream at the very beginning in '94, but then as artists came in and did things, it was like, well, this is what it is. I'm not going to sit here and stress that every artist isn't getting into the community and doing all this work. I was stressing over it for him. I thought they all ought to be out in the community. But he was very clear that this was an organic process, and that artists had to do what artists do, and that you couldn't force somebody to do something that was not organically in their DNA to do. So I think I think we all come at this from different perspectives because of what we bring from our backgrounds and our experiences.
I mean, wouldn't you say row houses was a response to what your environment?
Yeah. But I mean, but I'm just, but my question was really related. Actually, it comes up a lot, and I thought Peter Simic brought it up really well in an article he did about translation project in D Magazine. It was like, what's the difference between a backyard barbecue and some high art thing, and those are very complicated questions, I think, and I wrestle with them all the time, and I think it's a very valuable one, and I'll give the answer at another time. But I just, but there was someone that was hoping to have their hand up.